Let's continue on the third question. Third question, as we said, includes two parts. The first part is creating a class which contains a rectangle and color and the related constructor and the method to change rectangle and color. And the second part of the question is to implement this new class in our rectangle example code. Basically display a rectangle based on the rectangle created in this store sales bar chart fx class. So let's, in order to make clear, let me draw some lines and separate these two. And then remember we had that how to create classes 101 or step by step. We will perform the same. So the first step, create the class, create a class framework. So you will create this class with inheritance. And second step is to add field. There's no static field involved or static method. So all we need to do is starting at creating instance field. Then we will add constructor. Add a constructor, and in the constructor initialize rectangle. And fourth step is to add mutators and accessors. Here we don't have mutator, we only have accessor. And finally, business logic. Something to mention that was mentioned with is how do you set the sales name field in the superclass? Because you are adding a constructor which will accept the sales name, right? But since you are inheriting from the original class, you won't be able to, and the store sales field is private in the store sales bar chart class, in the parent class, you won't be able to directly inherit it. You won't be able to directly change it. So how are you going to set it? You will need to use the superclass constructor to set this up. And how do you call the super constructor? You need to think about it before we start. Then in the constructor, we will initialize rectangle to be an empty rectangle. Note this, we are saying this is an initialized rectangle, which does not have length and fields and width set yet. We are not saying that you will create a rectangle reference variable which is pointing to empty place, which is now. This is not right. We want to use a new keyword to create a rectangle. But that rectangle has to be initialized without length and width. So we will initialize color to be yellow. Then we will have an accessor method for these two fields. And finally, we will override store sales method so that after store sales is properly recorded, rectangle's width equals to store sales divided by 10. Again, when we override add store sales method and we want to set the sales, right? We still want to add the parameter transaction into the current store sales. How can we change that? It's the same question as here. The store sales field is actually a private field of the parent class. How do you access that? Can you directly add transaction to store sales? Apparently no, because store sales is private of the variable of the store sales of the parent class. So how do we add it? Before I start coding, you need to think about it. Then, based on the store sales, we will set the color. Okay, so let me copy this. Let me first create a sample class. And we said we want to go to assignment 7. And did I say assignment 7? Lab 7. So it's session 8. We have the store sales bar chart. And we will import this. Imports. Oh, sorry, not imports, extends. And we will, I'm clicking here. Sometimes Eclipse is not behaving. I need to wait a little bit, I think. Import from session 8. Okay, so now I import this. There's still an error message saying we need to add constructor because there's no implicit constructor defined for this one. We will handle this later when we create the constructor. But now let me copy this over. All these will be pseudocodes. I'm going to, I think there's a commented out. I'm going to convert all these to pseudocode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight these, select all, right click on source. And in the source session, I'm going to change that to comments. So all these are comments now. Okay, so let's start by creating this. We already created this, so I'm going to add java comment. And I'm going to copy this over. The second step is to add fields. And I'm going to directly move this up. Rec. And color. So fields are added. Now constructor. Constructor will be a public store sales bar chart fx with a store name, with a sales name. Now, there's an error. Super is undefined. There's no implicit constructor from the previous one. So we need to involve another constructor inside the parent class. And this is the note we want to say. How do you set the name? This will be, you will need to create, you will need to invoke a superclass constructor, which will accepts a sales name. And how do you do that? It's as simple as super sales name, right? And also inside the constructor, you will need to initialize rec. And remember, super has to be the first word, right? So let's say I create a new. If I move this up, there will be error because super has to be the first statement in a constructor. You need to create a parent class first before you can do your own work. And similarly, color will be dot yellow. Why did I put the green yellow? Yellow. And because this is actually a field, it's a final field. It's an enumerator type, so I can directly assign it instead of using a new. So we get this initialization done. And now that the rectangle has, that rec has an object, but we haven't defined the length and width yet. Now for create the accessors, this should be easy. Public will be called get rec, which will return rec. And similarly, we will have this public get color, which will return color. And finally, we need to override add store cells method. So let's copy the definition of add store cells, the signature of add store cells. Here, we will not be able to add transaction to store cells because we won't be able to access store cells. It says store cells is not visible. It's a private field. So what we need to do is call the previous store cells, add store cells, the superclass. But how do we know this is superclass? Actually, you can see that as the color suggests, this add store cells is the same as store cells. So if I write this way, I'm going to call myself again and again and again. I'm going to be stuck in the infinite loop until we add this transaction too many times that eventually store cells is going out of the boundary of double, and we will have a JVM failure. If I want to specify that this add store cells, I want to call the parent class add store cells, I need to put super. And you can immediately see that the color are now different. They are different methods now. Eclipse and Java Virtual Machine is able to identify these are two different methods. Okay, so once we add the transaction, we're going to get cells. If get store cells greater than 800, we will set color to red. Else, if store cells greater than 300, 300, we will set that to color to green. All right, so thus far, we finished creating this class. All right, nothing fancy about it. But then, in the main method, we will create a let me bring up the request. So in the main method, okay, let's copy this over. It says, let me select this and convert this into comment. So in the rectangle example code, create a static field. Oops. It's called store sales voucher fx. It's actually you don't need to define this as static field, but rather it's just sales, and this comes from the same package, so there's no import needed. In the main method, initialize a field to a new store sales bar chart. So I'm going to create bar chart equals to new, let's call it test. And then we will have a bc.add store sales. Let's add it as 500. So you create the static field. You initialize a field. Actually, no, that's wrong. We should just directly initialize this to fx. And then now we initialize the field. We initialize the store cells name, add some value to the add store cells method. We will update start method to remove reference to rect1 and rect2 variables, and instead display the rectangle based on the rect field of the static field. Right. So we're going to get. Did we set the rectangles? I think I forgot one part where in the add cells we need to set the rect dot set widths. Okay, store cells divided by 10, right? And we also need to set height to 10. All right, so once you set add cells, you will need to add. I don't need the reference to rec1 anymore. I don't need a reference to rec2 either. But I will need to reference fx dot get rec. So let's run it. I make a mistake here. Can you see why? Because I forgot to set the x and y. So, but let's, okay. I think we will need to get rec dot set x. Let's still set this as 20. And get rec set y as 22. And another part, which is about the color, which is get rec. Oops. Set field, right? It should be for fx.getColor, so that you are filling that with the right color. You can see that it's green. If I change this to 800 or 900, which is above 800, so it's going to be red. Of course, there are much more you can do. This set x, set y, we're directly exposing the rectangle objects. A more secured way or more object-oriented way is actually to wrap this set x, y, and set field inside fx. And for example, you can set this here. Once you set the color, you will set the rec dot set field to color instead of setting this outside, right? So let me save it and remove this part and run it. Right? You can see the color is still properly applied. But basically what's happening here is we create this class. We wrapped rec and color inside and we initialize them. Once initialized, as the business logic change, as the store cells change, we will set the rectangle's widths and color. This is what we call business logic. And once we have the logic, we can create the instance outside in the Java FX framework. You have this, you expose the rectangle so that it will get properly drawn. Of course, you can set x, y, set x and set y can be assigned here. For us, we just try to save some time, so save some work. So we will do it here. But you got to know that you can move the set x and y into the object too, which will work just fine. And